In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the philosophical view known as direct realism, which is on the British Philosophy A-level syllabus, as well as the modern myth and meme that the Earth is flat. And although the planet is in fact round, it is not my intention today to mock or deride or even dispute anybody in particular who believes in the conspiracy. When I first made this channel 5 years ago, I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't ever use it to deliberately make anyone feel bad about themselves. And I actually think that flat earthers present a pretty interesting philosophical challenge, which goes like this. It's a myth. Part 1. That people thought the Earth was flat and what am I looking at? Till Columbus tried to sail round it. Some ancient peoples did believe in a flat Earth, but the ancient Greeks and Indians figured out the shape of the planet about 2,500 years ago, and societies that have been influenced by them have known the shape of the planet pretty much ever since. Columbus knew the Earth was round, he just thought it was a lot smaller than it actually is. He estimated that he would have just enough food and water to reach Japan, which by a lucky coincidence was just about the distance to the Caribbean, which nobody in Europe knew was there at the time. I say lucky coincidence, it was lucky for him, it was obviously unlucky for the millions of people who ended up dead or enslaved as a result. Despite the fact that the shape, however tiny a minority, shape of the planet has been known for a long time, do in fact believe that the Earth, for a long time, some people today, is flat, if we can take them at their word. The modern flat Earth conspiracy actually started in the 1800s with the work of people like Samuel Robotham and William Carpenter, the latter being the author of 100 Proofs the Earth is Not a Globe. Carpenter's proofs are varied. One or two of them are theological, quite a few of them are just him not knowing how things like gravity works, which is fine, not everyone does understand that, and that's okay, but one or two of them are very interesting philosophically, because they claim that things appear a certain way, and therefore they are. The best possessions of man are that way. For instance, number his senses, and when he uses them all, number 18 says, he will not be deceived in his survey of nature. It is only when some one faculty or other is neglected or abused that he is deluded. Every man in full command of his senses knows that a level surface is a flat or horizontal one, but astronomers tell us that the true level is the curved surface of a globe. They know that man requires a level surface on which to live, so they give him one in name, which is not one in fact. Since this is the best that astronomers with their theoretical science can do for their fellow creatures, deceive them, it is clear that things are not as they say they are, and in short, it is a proof that the Earth is not a globe. In other words, it is flat. The horizon appears... This is an appeal to something like to be flat, and therefore like the philosophical position known as direct realism, or sometimes naive realism, which says simply that we perceive the world. This, of course, entails the position that there is in fact a world out there outside of our minds that can be perceived and talked about. Contrast direct realism with indirect realism, which is the idea that yes, there is a world out there, but we don't perceive it. What actually happens is that objects in that world out there cause representations to appear in our brains, and that's what we perceive. These representations are sometimes called sense data. For bonus, Berkeley's idealism points contrast direct realism, which is the position that there is in fact and indirect realism, with no world out there independent of our minds that can be talked about anyway, and that to be is to be perceived. I've talked more about Berkeley's idealism elsewhere. You can click that card that's just appeared in the top right if you want to hear more about it. Part 2. Optical illusions. Nobody's going to get that reference. Direct realism isn't wildly popular, although it does have its defenders, mainly because it's pretty easy to mount at least a decent stab at critiquing it. One such critique is the argument from illusion. I'm going to be using the philosopher A.J. Ayer as my source here, not because he was the first person to come up with these ideas, beloved of British philosophy A-level teachers by any means, but because he writes very teachers. The argument from illusion goes like this, very clearly, and for that reason is this. Sometimes we perceive things that aren't really there, or so we think, and therefore we can't be perceiving the world directly. The classic example is a stick. If you put it in water, it appears to bend because of refraction, and we know it isn't really bent, it just appears that way in here. But in fact, flat Earth would do just as nicely as an example. We look at the horizon, it appears to be flat because it's so big, but actually it isn't. Ergo, we are not perceiving the world directly. We have a mental representation of a flat horizon, but in fact there is no such thing. It's just curved and really big. The fact that we can perceive an even stronger version of the contradictory things. If I see an argument from illusion might cite the stand 3 feet in front of a mirror, it will appear that I'm standing inside 3 feet behind the surface. I can't be in 2 places at once, ergo one of those things must be false. There must be sense data in my brain that don't correspond to anything real out there in the world. I said A.J. Ayer wasn't the first person to talk about ideas like these, and the philosopher John Locke, when he managed to spare time out of his busy schedule of being an enormous racist, whose various moral and philosophical shortcomings I've discussed before, came up with the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are things that objects have in themselves. Secondary qualities arise, like mass, arise from primary qualities, shape, number, but aren't really in the objects, they're just in here. Like taste or colour, for instance. We could say that these 2 apples appear to be red, but aren't really red. And we know it's just an appearance because if we were to look at them under different lights or show them to people who are colourblind, then they wouldn't appear that way. They just look that way to us because of the way their skin reflects light. Colour is in here in a way that things like number and mass presumably aren't, unless you agree with Berkeley. Arguably then, if flat earthers are trying to appeal to direct realism, then maybe they're not being placed in water really do bear strict enough, since they present, or that objects far away presumably don't also believe that sticks are just small. Carpenter did believe that the sun orbits the Earth and that the Earth doesn't rotate, but he at least acknowledged that things that are far away aren't just tiny. Part 3. Science! But all that's pretty standard stuff. I know you don't come to Philosophy Tube just to watch me read out Wikipedia articles on philosophy in a sexy accent. You come here to get mind f***ed. So what's the really juicy stuff? Well, it's tempting to say that when people deny scientific evidence about the shape of the planet or about climate change or vaccinations or whatever, that there's a problem with them, or at least that in investigating one. On YouTube, you can find all kinds of why they deny it, or investigate the channels that spend time should begin with the person, debunking or sometimes outright mocking conspiracy theorists or 9/11 truthers or climate change deniers or creationists or what have you. But what if we're looking in the wrong place? What if people denying scientific evidence has less to do with them and more to do with the nature of scientific claims themselves? In her book, The Rhetoric of Economics, economist Deirdre McCluskey writes that whilst the scientific methodology proceeds according to experimentation and evidence, any particular instance of someone making a scientific claim, either out loud or in writing, is an attempt to consider the fact that science persuade their audience. Scientific papers will cite other papers, and those two are not the same thing. Papers and reference the results of those experiments, just as I cite authors in the bottom left of the screen there. When the author of a scientific paper cites another experiment, unless they've explicitly repeated that experiment themselves, McCluskey says they're essentially making an argument from authority. They're saying, you can trust these results, which isn't a scientific demonstration. It's an attempt to persuade you. McCluskey goes through some of the most famous papers in economics and explains how they attempt to persuade, not to demonstrate, using certain metaphors here, a or two. What often goes on particular authorial voice stated, she says, is an appeal to authority, implicit assumption that the book or the academic paper or the scientific experiment is worth writing up. And if it's worth writing, it must be worth it relative to some goal or set of values. So you can understand now why a sociologist might tell us that science, with a capital S, is a social construct. Scientific methodology is not to be confused with any particular conversation about science, or who decides how those conversations happen, where and when they happen, or with what allocation of topic any scientific claim. There's the evidence and funding. McCluskey says yes, but there's also the rhetoric. Says there's two parts to rhetoric: how it's said, how it attempts to persuade. Is it simple? We like things to be simple and elegant. Is there a nice diagram? We like there to be nice diagrams. What kind of metaphors does it use? Ooh, that's a good one. Here's a famous example. Galileo Galilei is credited with demonstrating that the Earth orbits the Sun. People used to think that the Sun went round us and that we were the centre of the universe. The fact that Galileo persisted in his experiments despite persecution from the Catholic Church is held up in programs like Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos as a vindication of science and the scientific method, and by proxy of scientists themselves in phases of the planet Venus. What Galileo observed through Venus, which would have been impossible to the telescope though, was the changing sea if Venus orbited the Earth. The fact that Venus appears to us fully illuminated in the sky means that it must be on the far side of the Sun from us. Hence he observed that Venus orbits the Sun. And this was the clincher in demonstrating to many people that the Earth does too. However, note that this is an argument from some observable evidence, yes, but it's also an argument from analogy. Venus orbits the Sun. Venus is a planet like Earth, therefore Earth also orbits the Sun. It's the analogy, and that was not between Earth and Venus demonstrated. And, of course, that's really the clincher here. Some astronomers of the time accepted Galileo's findings, but didn't embrace the heliocentric model of the solar system with the Sun at the centre right away. Some of them switched to what's called the Tychonic model, where yes, all the other planets orbit the Sun, but the Sun orbits the Earth. You might be inclined to treat McCluskey's ideas or similar ideas with disdain, especially this science is a social construct rubbish. In his paper, Why You Should Believe It, the philosopher John Searle takes a big swipe at all this relativism, as he puts it. He writes, "The Speech Act commits you to the truth of what you say, and therefore to the existence acts are made from a point of view of a fact in the world correspond to and typically within certain sorts of to that truth. Such speech ways of thinking, but the statements and assertions do not thereby become about the points of view or the ways of thinking." Trouble is, I think Searle's tilting at windmills here. He's determinedly arguing that the world definitely exists and that it is a certain way, whatever way that is, and that we can talk about it. And that's something that not a lot of people would disagree with the possible exception of Berkeley. The McCluskey-ish point isn't that science is worthless or impossible. Far from it. Just that any particular scientific statement is always made in a social context that will affect greatly, not necessarily even its truth, but just how and form of the statement itself, and maybe whether that truth is taken, even the ability to make it, not by anybody, as well as the form. Searle also has a somewhat simplistic view of what counts as evidence. Probably everybody could agree to the general claim certain statements require certain standards of evidence. However, who decides what evidence will be accepted is often crucial, practically speaking. For instance, the government of Ontario have in the past refused to accept oral testimony as evidence in land disputes with the Teme Augama and Anishinaabe people. They say they'll only accept written documents as evidence, which is a bit of a pisser if your culture relies a lot. Might explain an awful lot on oral testimony. It might explain how scientists rhetorical dimension of scientists and educated people can come to believe all kinds of weird, nonsensical things for which there isn't really good evidence. Scientists, mainstream scientists, the majority of scientists used to believe that there was a demonstrable hierarchy of races, or that you could tell somebody's race or their propensity to criminality by measuring the size and shape of their skull. People used to believe that you could make populations overall healthier and happier by exterminating or sterilizing those with bad genes. Some people still believe that today. In her book Fatal Invention, Bioethics again, in multiple modern physicist Dorothy Roberts demonstrates in present-day scientific that even though it comes up again in scientific investigations, race isn't even a sensible biological category at all. These scientists weren't daft. They'd studied anatomy, they'd seen and measured human skulls. They were just persuaded that this was all true. And the socially constructed conditions of persuasion lowered the bar of evidence that they needed to get over for their unstated goals, and often their stated ones as well. So, bringing us around to flat Earth again, some of William Carpenter's proofs are very explicitly about not being persuaded. Number 8 asks if the world is round or a globe. Numbers 67, why do ships navigate using 94 and 99 all say that's maps that are printed flat instead of on? Scientists keep changing their mind about stuff and therefore they can't really know anything. None of those have anything whatsoever to do with the evidence. They just all note a failure to be rhetorically persuaded. Recall McCluskey's point that to do science at all is to presume, often implicitly, that it will further some goal, so people can become suspicious of what the implicit goal of the scientist is. NASA tells us that the world is round, but why do they tell us that? People say that vaccines are good for you. Why do they tell you that? And if it's because they care about your health and are altruistic, then why is there also a massive for-profit healthcare industry? Debunker of conspiracies, and he gets Miles Power here on YouTube. His countless accusations of being bribed is a popular explainer of science enabled by corporations with an agenda. Although these concerns are irrelevant to the scientific evidence itself, they attack the individual attempted act of persuasion that any particular presentation of evidence entails. The historian Silvia Federici refers to a process she calls the enclosure of knowledge. The process from the 15th to the 17th centuries whereby knowledge was taken away and gated off by the witch hunts. Traditional knowledges and folk knowledges were criminalized. Medicine and women's reproductive care in particular were taken away from women and given to men as per our ideas today. In the world, part of the program of social repression and mold of capitalism born out of mass murder that was the foundation of many of the witch hunts and out of slavery and colonialism, a world of shadowy backroom deals, mistrust, collusion, the government man who means well but has his own agenda, massively powerful authority figures who don't seem to be accountable to anybody, and the atomization of the old communal ways of living and knowing, it's perhaps unsurprising that some people will say things like this.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms. The people of this country have had enough of experts.
Don't take what I'm saying the wrong way. I'm not advocating for a flippant or a relativist attitude towards scientific evidence. I'm denying scientific evidence is sometimes I'm not even sure I would advocate for a actually really dangerous, even fail and let live attitude towards it, since fatal. What I'm saying is it's maybe not actually that surprising that some people will doubt the very shape of the planet itself and say, I don't need someone else with their own agenda to tell me what's what. For my practical purposes, which aren't yours, the evidence of my own eyes is enough. To quote John Locke himself, the certainty of things existing in rerum natura, when we have the testimony of our senses for it, is not only as great as our frame can attain to, but as our condition needs. Maybe the fact that some people deny scientific evidence is less a bug with them. Some people will be persuaded by it as it is a feature of human conversation, different techniques. and actions, including scientific ones. That's how we all get on and live with each other in the face of that, especially when denying the evidence on things like climate change and vaccination can be really dangerous to everyone. That's the great human challenge, isn't it? Patreon.com/philosophytube is where fans of the show can donate and help keep it going. Alternatively, paypal.me/philosophytube is where you could make a one-time donation.